All right, we come to our second hour. Last hour, we discussed this logic gap. And as I mentioned, we're going to be doing two more lessons, kind of filling these gaps in. So we're going to be talking about filling in the language gap. What do I mean by a language gap? Well, if we look at the Bible and what it was originally written, we wind up saying that it was in mostly Hebrew in the Old Testament with some Aramaic, mostly Greek is the New Testament with some Aramaic here and there, and none of us speak those languages. And so that's a big gap to start with. And so we're going to start with a talk a little bit about some translations, because I think that's the first step in filling this gap of understanding what the Bible is and how to deal with it. So translations are an interesting study all by themselves. We're not going to spend the whole time on just that, but there are a few key points that I think we need to talk about. First of all is recognizing how we even got this thing we call the Bible. And I've kind of got a chart here I want you to kind of think about as we build it up. Because we start with the top when we say that God revealed his word to these inspired men. And we have a variety of them that wrote all the way from Moses with the book of Genesis to John with the book of Revelation as a kind of bookends of the Old and New Testament, and lots of authors in between. And it's kind of interesting to think about because people ask me sometimes, well, describe inspiration. Tell me, what is it that inspiration, how does it work? And the only answer I can give you is pick this up and read it, because this is inspiration. You know, this is how we got this. But those men wrote this stuff down. And what you would call the original document, you know, Moses sitting in that tent in the wilderness with his pen, having been trained in the Egyptian style of writing, but then also understanding Hebrew because that was the background of his people, having that education. He's writing on these scrolls what we now have as the first 5 books of Moses. And we don't have them. Those scrolls that he wrote on, we would call the autograph copies. In other words, that's the originals that he could have signed on the bottom, right? And we don't have any from Moses. We don't have any from the Old Testament prophets. We don't have any from the New Testament writers. We have none of the original documents. And so you think, well, that's kind of a hindrance. Well, turns out, even in the secular world, we have a lot of things that we know and have, and without having any of the originals that Caesar wrote or some things like that. Because what happened is other people, and we're going to call them scribes, got together with these original documents, and they then would make copies of them. We don't have any of those originals, but these scribes, they made a lot of copies. And the copies are what we call manuscripts. And you've probably heard that word before. And a manuscript is simply a copy of that autograph or a copy of another manuscript in the same language. Now, when you start copying things like that, can errors occur? Yeah. But it's kind of interesting that they went through a lot of trouble to make sure that they had as few changes and differences as possible. And when you say, well, how can you then trust it? Well, when you get to the manuscript, just from New Testament manuscripts, we got over 5,000 of these things. And the number of changes and variations that you find are extremely small. So we have enough evidence together that we can trust that those manuscripts have in it what God expected us to have. So those are original language things. But now we still have a problem, because even if I had a nice copy of one of those manuscripts, it'd still be in Hebrew or Greek, and I still couldn't read it. And so we have another group of people that come in, and there's these language scholars, right? And they translate from the original language into a different language. Well, it's amazing when you look at it, because the Bible is probably the most translated work in the entire history of mankind. The Bible has been translated into hundreds of languages, and there's hardly a place on this planet you can go where you can't find a Bible that's been translated into the language of the people that's there. So that's that in itself is interesting. But here's the two parts that I want you to understand. That top part, when God revealed it and they wrote it down, that is the inspiration. That is the part that God went to directly and had direct contact with his people. From there on out, we're looking at the providence of God to have preserved all of this. That's the preservation part of it. And so when we do find a manuscript jot or tittle that's not quite in place, we shouldn't be blaming God for that. That's a person who made those copy errors, right? But God made sure that there were enough of those copies around that we could find our way around it. We could come to a knowledge there without him having to have some miraculous version of it that shows up once every lifetime in order for us to have faith in our Bible. But those translations are what we have to work with. And most of us speak English. In this country, there are only 2 or 3, very popular languages. English and Spanish are probably 2 of the biggest now, but as you go worldwide, you get some others. But we're going to talk about the English translations that have come out for just a minute. Okay, one more thing before we get there. Got ahead of myself. About translations. You start thinking, well, can we really understand what God says if I can't read it in the original language that he inspired this man to write? And that might be a really good question to think about, except for one really interesting thing. LXX. Anybody ever seen those 3 Roman numerals together? And all together, they spell 70. Now, this is the first mystery that I've come to, because the readings about it says that when Ptolemy, back in the 3rd century, started this, we get to about 130 BC when this translation was done. And he wanted 6 scholarly members, 1 from each of the 12 tribes. And so it's called the 70. And if you do the math, there should have been 72 people. And I guess they just didn't want to put the extra 2 Roman numerals on the end of it there. So we got 70 instead of 72. But they came together and translated the Old Testament from Hebrew and Aramaic into Greek. And that's what we now know and have copies of as the Septuagint translation. And why is that significant? Well, at the time, this was when Alexander the Great had finished kind of conquering his part of the world. And now, post-Alexander, Greek culture had been spread all over. Greek was the common language across a huge part of the world. And now the Old Testament was in the common language. And how do we know it was widely spread? If you look at some of the quotes, have you ever been reading in your Bible and where you've got something that's either highlighted or it's uppercase and it shows you, well, this is a quote from an Old Testament passage. And then you go look at the Old Testament passage and it's close, but it's not quite the same. I mean, it's obvious it means the same, but maybe the words are a little different. You're wondering, what's that difference? Most of the time, that's because the New Testament is quoting from the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. And in fact, when Paul was writing to even some of the Gentiles in his day, and he uses a lot of scriptures and things, he was expecting they would have had access to the Septuagint translation. So even at that time, when most of the world did not speak Hebrew, they had a Greek translation they could work from. And so we can work from translations to understand what God wants us to know. And so even when we see this with the early Christian writers quoting it and things, we say, well, we probably have a bunch of different translations here. King James is probably a common translation. Some people have a King James, and then there's probably New American Standard, and some people have ESV, and there's probably some people with NIV, and I could go on and on and on, and it would get less likely that you would have one, but there's lots and lots of English translations. You might wonder, what's the difference? Why are they different? Sometimes when you read them, they use slightly different words, they use slightly different sentence structure. So we need to understand that a little bit. First, some translations have as a goal that's different. Their goal may be, I want to try to stick as close to the original language as possible. Well, that's a worthy goal, but sometimes a direct translation of the words may not give you as good a sense of what's meant. And so some translations try to convey the meaning. They're trying to get as close to literal as they can, but they want to convey more of the meaning of what the passage says. Okay? And then you have some translations that are trying to convey the thoughts. And so they're less concerned about sticking with the original language than they are about making sure that they help you understand what the passage is trying to say. And then there are some that just go, I'm going to paraphrase. I'll just kind of throw out what I think it says. Well, you can see that's quite a range of philosophy there. Another thing that causes some differences is the translators may have access to different texts, and that has happened over time. Can you imagine the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, are a modern day thing? The King James translators did not have access to the Dead Sea Scrolls. They hadn't been found yet. And so as each of these translations, sometimes they have other manuscripts that they have access to. So if you look at English translations, a lot of eye candy here, but I just want to point a couple of things out. Right around here, King James, that's 1611. I have an electronic copy. Actually, I think I have a paper one too, because I love looking at it, of the Tyndale translation, which was in 1525. There's less than 100 years difference between Tyndale and King James. And yet when you line them up side by side, you will see some significant differences. I can't remember if I put any of the Tyndale things in any of my lectures, but just sometimes you can go look it up on the web and you'll start looking at it. You can sort of read it, but they don't spell things the way that we do. Spelling was more optional. And the same word might be spelled different ways in different places in the text. And so they cleaned up a lot of that by 1611. But have you imagined that language didn't change from 1611 to what are we now, 2024? You think there are some words that are in the King James translation that wouldn't be used the same way today? That's one of the reasons we have every so often new translations coming, is because trying to keep up with the English language. The English language is evolving. I bet you even in our lifetimes, you had words. You know, when I was, everybody knows the Fred Flintstone jingle. He's going to have a gay old time. That could mean something totally different in today's society, right? That's only a few years, and a word has changed in meaning. And so one of the things we have to be careful of when we're looking at translation is making sure that we're understanding what that word meant when it was originally written. And that's why you see some differences over the years in the translations, because those English words that they're using change in meaning. So I threw one on the end. You get all the way from there, all the way up to 2001. You've got English Standard Version. There's been more after that. New American Standard issued a 2020 update, and others along the line. And I kind of put this, I liked this chart, and borrowing this to give you an example. It doesn't have all the translations on it, but you kind of see word for word, meaning for meaning, thought for thought, paraphrase, and where that fits on that line. And there's different people that have different ideas about exactly where on the line you might put one of them. But for example, translations like the New American Standard or the ESV, or even the King James or the New King James, are on this end of the scale, trying to be close to the original language, where you have things like the NIV that is pretty common, but it gets more to this end of the scale where they're trying to do thought equivalents. So when I show these kind of things and talk to people more detail about translations, common question is, then which translation should I use? And I used to have a ready answer for that, but I've changed it over time. Because I think the best, if you're only going to have one, pick the one that you'll read. That's going to be your best one. If you're going to have two, and I highly recommend it, get one on this end of the scale, pick a New American Standard or an ESV. I don't normally recommend the King James because very few of us were raised reading Shakespeare these days. And so we don't understand it quite as well. And when we're going to teach someone else, they may not understand the language quite as well. So one of these is going to be a little better in that regard, but I would couple it with something like the NIV to kind of give you a little difference there. But I will caveat that and say, please get the 1984 rendition of the NIV because their update in 2001, they kind of went further down the scale. And there's lots of places where there's some difficulties. Now, is it still a terrible translation? No, I'm not going to get on a soapbox and try to dissuade you about any of these. I just want you to understand the caveats. Does that make sense? That you need to just understand what you're reading, where it comes from. And so balance it. And if you find it easier to read one of these others, then by all means, read it. But the biggest way you're going to understand God's word first is to be able to pick it up and read it. That's the beginning. That's the start. So, but with two translations or even more, or if you're a real geek like me, you get a Bible program and I got 30 different English translations. And that gets to be a lot of fun when you're starting to look things up, trying to figure some things out. We'll see some of that as we go. But you can still do that just fine with print. You want a computer program? You can start with something simple. If you've got a computer, there's a thing called eSword. That's a free program. And you can get some little add-ins. So for not a lot of money, you can get 2 or 3 of these translations and have an easy tool to do some comparisons. And then it goes up from there. But the main thing is be familiar with the book, get a Bible that you will read, and that's the beginning to cross this language gap, because here's what you've got, something in your language you can read. But even with that, as we go on and we say, yeah, but there's still going to be some times when we're going to try to understand what a passage means, or we'll look at 2 translations and there will be some differences in the words, and we need to understand what happened here. What's the difference? So there are times when a translation can be biased by the translators. What do I mean by that? The translators may come from a particular religious background where they believe a particular thing, and they will write that word in. So as we're thinking about understanding this, that gets down to the part what we call semantics. What does the word really mean? And so we'll have to study and work in there. Semantics is just the study of linguistic meaning. Can the same word in English mean something different depending on the context of the sentence? Yeah. And you've probably stumbled over those. And there's times when 2 words are spelled the same. We were talking about some of those recently in the car. My wife is teaching my grandson music, and one of the little folk songs that he was learning on the piano, she wanted him to work on it a little bit more. And so she wrote polish on the page, sent it home with him. So he was supposed to polish the song. And then the next week she looked at it and she goes, I don't know why I thought that was a Polish folk song. And that's the same word, right? I mean, it looks like the same word, but it's not, because it can mean 2 different things in different contexts. So we have to be careful of some of that as well. And when you think about, we understand that innately as you're learning a language, even when you're a child learning this is all something that kind of becomes second nature to us in a way. But there's another thing about reading the Bible we have to be careful of. And that is, sometimes there's an emotional connection and content that we can only get from the context. And sometimes when we read it, if we just kind of read it flat, it doesn't convey quite as much. Give you an example. When David was bringing the ark into Jerusalem, David is ecstatic. He is out there, they're having a celebration. The ark is finally coming in the way it's supposed to, being carried on the shoulders of the priests. And he is dancing his heart out before the Lord in the great celebration. He gets home, and his wife, Michal, has been looking out the window, watching the celebration. Now, if you read it flat, it simply says, her comment to him when he came in the door was, how glorious the king was today. Now, there's a couple of ways you could take that. You know, if she were meaning that in a sense of support and understanding David's emotions and things, she could have said, how glorious the king was today. You know, this was great. I'm not sure that's the context if you read it through. It was more like, how glorious the king was today. Now, we don't get to do that when we're reading. I mean, when you can do it if you're in a play or somebody's reading it for you or whatever, but doesn't that change how you view the sentence and the statement? And so I would urge you, as you're reading, think about it, use your imagination, understand what the context is there, and think about how those people would have said those things as well when you're reading that dialogue, because in a lot of ways it helps the scriptures come alive. It's not just some flat words that you're reading. There's life in here. And we need to be able to understand that life and pull it in. And so that's a big part of overcoming this language gap that we have. So, guidelines for those who are not Greek or Hebrew scholars. That includes me. I suspect I'm talking to an audience that this is going to be applicable to. First of all, use your multiple English Bible versions. If somebody wants to argue a Greek word, just haul out the multiple English translations, because the first thing you want to look at is those guys that do those translations. Typically, it's not just one person translating each one. 70 people worked on the Septuagint. There were hundreds of people that worked on the New American Standard, hundreds of people from various backgrounds that worked on the English Standard Version translation. I guarantee those were people who put a lot of time and effort into understanding it. So when I put multiple of them together, I'm getting the help of thousands of scholars. So that's a starting point. And then you can go to your Bible dictionaries, you can go to your thesauruses, you can go to your lexicons and those kinds of things. Those are all helps. But use that next. First, look at the text. And then you can start looking at the language down a little further if you need to. It's vocabulary. Use a good reference. There's some simple ones. Vines makes a good one. That's a good thing. I've got these two that I don't even remember what they're called. Nobody does. The names are too long. They're called BDAG, BDAG, and HALOT, HALOT. And those are Hebrew language translations and Greek language translations. But the cool thing about those is they use other texts from the same time period to look into what does this word mean, not only just how it was used in the Bible at that time, but how was it used in contemporary texts where we have them. So especially in the New Testament, that can be very important. And we'll see some of that in our class lesson on Sunday. So then we can look for applicable historical references. What does it say in history? Are there external writings that can help shed some light on this? Sometimes you can stop with the multiple translations. You can find it. You can go, oh, I understand it now. But there's a hierarchy. You can start digging down. And none of it requires you to be a real scholar. It just requires you to be careful with how you use those references. Okay? And here's really important. If someone is trying to make a point from scriptures, and the only way that they can make you understand their point is by saying, I have found a hidden meaning in this Greek or Hebrew word, and they're not a Greek or Hebrew scholar, I can guarantee you that they probably aren't getting it right. So that's not how we should approach teaching people. The people we're trying to reach with the gospel don't speak Hebrew and Greek. And so don't start with something that goes, oh, well, the Greek word for this is. It's okay to know that, and it's okay to study that, but that's not your starting point, because they're not going to know that. You need to connect with people, and it's going to be in English, not in Hebrew or Greek. All right. Were there ever translation errors? I think we can find an easy one here. In Acts the 12th chapter and verse 4, if you look in the King James, even the current renderings of the King James, it says there, when he had apprehended him, he put him in prison and delivered him to 4 quaternions of soldiers to keep him, intending after Easter to bring him forth to the people. Easter is something that didn't really exist around Paul's time. But if you look at New American Standard, Young's literal translation, you clearly see that the intent was supposed to be Passover. So there's an easy one. And the multiple translations just fix that right away. If you run across it and you go, whoa, what does that word mean? Go look it up in another one and see if it helps you out. That make sense? So there can be problems with translations. But I want you to turn over to Hebrews, the 9th chapter, because sometimes a little deeper meaning of the word helps you understand a passage better. And sometimes we get the wrong impression because of some of the words that are used. There's not a lot of those places, but Hebrews 9 is one of them. Hebrews 9 has the lines, if we look at verse 15 and down, it says, "For this reason he is the mediator of a new covenant, so that since a death has taken place for the redemption of the transgressions that were committed under the first covenant, those who have been called may receive the promise of the eternal inheritance. For where a covenant is, there must of necessity be the death of the one who made it. For a covenant is valid only when men are dead, for it is never in force while the one who made it lives. Therefore, even the first covenant was not inaugurated without blood. For when every commandment had been spoken by Moses to all the people according to the law, he took the blood of the calves and the goats and the water and scarlet and hyssop and sprinkled both the book itself and all the people, saying, 'This is the blood of the covenant which God commanded you.'" Now, I'm sure most of us have read that multiple times. But if you really start thinking about it in the same context as we were talking about logic from our previous lecture, there starts to be some things that catch your eye there. If you were reading in the King James, you would have seen that the word is, "For where a testament is, there needs to be the death of the testator." Now, we understand last wills and testaments, right? Someone dies, this last will that they wrote goes into effect, and it describes how they want things distributed that were theirs. But is that really the sense that he's trying to get across here? That's the way it was translated. Well, it turns out that the word testament in the King James English was equivalent to a word of covenant then, which is why when I read out of the New American Standard, it said covenant. The ESV puts will in there, which kind of has more of the sense of testament. Young's literal translation does covenant, and NIV uses will, so we got a scattering all over the place. And then the green there is the other one that kind of catches your attention, because one of them says testator, one who made it must, covenant victim, one who made it. And you're thinking, okay, there's a problem here. Let's think about the logical problem first. If this is a last will and testament of Jesus Christ, and when he died, it went into effect, it sounds okay so far, except what would happen to the last will and testament when the one who died came to life again? It doesn't really fit that. We don't even know what to do there hardly, other than even in the courts on the few examples of when somebody has been declared dead and then they find them, it becomes a real issue of how do you settle all of this stuff. But he makes a comparison to make that even more complicated. He goes down and says it's just like what happened under the law of Moses. Well, Moses didn't die to put the Old Testament into effect, but he tells you what happened there. What'd they do? They sacrificed a bunch of animals, right? And that was the blood of the covenant. And Jesus said, "This is my blood of the covenant." So there's a comparison being made between the sacrifices of the old law, which were not the ones who made the testament, and Jesus, who did make it, but he also died. That sounds confusing at first, but it's all because we have the concept of testament there instead of covenant. So if we look at a lot of other places in the Bible and say, what is it about a covenant that we need to understand? Well, let's go and look. This is from Vines, and he says this word, diateke, which is can be testament, can be will, primarily signifies a disposition of property or by will or otherwise. In its use in the Septuagint, it is the rendering of a Hebrew word meaning a covenant. Okay, there's your first clue that there's some kind of difference here. It's an agreement from a verb signifying to cut or divide. That's really interesting, because when you think about Abraham, when God made the covenant with Abraham, we go back and look at that description of a covenant. What did God tell him to do? He said to take these animals, cut them in half, and then the Spirit of God kind of moved between these covenant victims, these animals that were sacrificed for that covenant, right? So we get a little bit of picture there. It's an allusion to a sacrificial custom in connection with covenant making. So it's not the last will and testament. It has to do with what are you making as a covenant? Well, let's go a little further. Here's one from Vines where you start looking at testator, the word that they translate testator there, but he comes up with an interesting explanation of it because covenant making, the sacrifice of a victim was customary. And he goes ahead and quotes the Old Testament passages there where you can see that. He who made a covenant did so at the cost of a life. Now, think about Hebrews 9. Was the Old Testament covenant ratified at the cost of lives? It was those animal lives, but they were sacrificed and the blood was sprinkled. And that was the blood that was part of that covenant, right? Was Jesus' covenant put into place at the cost of a life? It was. But in this case, it was just one sacrifice. It was the sacrifice of our Lord. So that's starting to come together as a better picture of what he's trying to say here in Hebrews 9. So I think even with this, we get a really good explanation. And he likes that there. He says, for this reason, adhering to the meaning covenant making is better. The rendering the death of the testator would make Christ a testator, which he was not. He did not die simply that the terms of the testamentary disposition might be fulfilled. He is the mediator of a new covenant. He himself was the covenant victim, and it was his death that was necessary. So there we've got a good explanation of what they mean. But it's kind of interesting because we think of the Old Testament and the New Testament. Kind of would have been better if we'd called them the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. That would have been better English words that would have helped us as our language has changed to understand what he had in mind there. But that's not the end of it. It's kind of interesting because testament occurs 12 times here, and this is from Easton's Bible Dictionary. And I like it where he says that the Vulgate translates incorrectly by testamentum, whence the names old and new, by which we now designate the two sections into which the Bible was convened. So a lot of these references are coming up and helping to clarify what he means in Hebrews 9. And then outside references. And this is one of my favorites. My wife is laughing because I like to put this one up here. I found this one day when I was reading through some ancient translations. Yes, I have a weird hobby. I read through old stuff sometimes. And I ran across this one. It was really kind of funny because they don't know exactly what some of the translations were, as close as they come. So this guy was sent by the king to go make sure that two people who were supposed to be making peace, a covenant of peace, were doing it right. So here we have an example of covenant making that dates back into the 1700s BC. Now, Moses dates from about 1450 BC. So this is even pre-Moses. And here's what he wrote. To my Lord, say, your servant, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name, the tablet of Ibel Adad from Alasklap reached me, and I went to him to kill an ass between the Hanu and the Itamaras. Okay, so those are the two people that are trying to make peace. And he said, I went to them to kill an ass, the donkey there that was going to be the sacrificial victim. Covenant victim. Sound familiar? But he says, when I got there, they had a puppy and a lettuce. And that's the one they're not sure what that is. But the idea was it wasn't a good sacrifice. How seriously were they taking this covenant? The idea was the animal that was being sacrificed, the covenant victim, gave you a good idea about how serious this covenant was. So when Moses enacted the covenant, you read through that, they didn't just sacrifice one lamb. There were lambs and there were bulls and there was a lot of animals being sacrificed. And how long did that sacrificial system last? They kept sacrificing those animals for years and years. How many sacrifices do we have for the covenant of Jesus Christ? One. But which one was better? Which one showed the importance of the covenant? You see, that's the lesson he wants us to learn from Hebrews 9. And sometimes that word testament might get in the way but it's easy for us to see. Just use some simple tools like this. And now you open it up and you see what the Hebrew writer is saying, that he wants us to understand this covenant. So, also be careful of meanings derived from roots. This was another one that I ran across that I got rather amused at when I first read it. Over in 1 Corinthians 4th chapter and verse 1, it says, let a man regard us in this manner as servants of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. Well, servants of Christ. Well, this word here that's translated servants, it's a pretty common word, typically means servants, officer, attendant. You'll find it in multiple verses if you go look it up. But early 1900s, this guy named R.C. Trench did a root word study of this. And he came up and said, oh, if you go to the root word of this Greek word, then the root word there came from a word that meant rower. And since we're talking about a hierarchy, this would have been a subordinate rower. And then he wrote a series of sermons based on the lessons we can learn from subordinate rowers. Except that this word never came from that root, had no context or meaning with it. And while he might have said some good things about our being servants to Christ, it's not from that root word. All right. You can do better just by saying, I'm a servant of Jesus Christ. That's what it means. Problem is, it was never used as a rower in the New Testament time period. So if you're thinking about root word studies and somebody wants to prove something really interesting from a root word, I always go back and go, what would a root word study tell you about butterflies? Because that comes from two words, butter and flies. And so I'm supposed to get something special out of butterflies from butter and flies? No, those two together have a different meaning, do they not? So be careful with that. Now, that doesn't mean that root studies are totally useless. It just means that most of us are not qualified to do that. And so be really careful with it. Can we look things up in these dictionaries and things? Absolutely. They can help clarify things. But let's be careful with how we use it. Be careful of what I call semantic anachronism. It occurs when a later use of the word is read back into earlier literature or vice versa, where a word has changed in meaning and we go back and forth between them. It can occur in the same language. The Greek early church fathers, for example, they write about bishops, which is a word that's used in the New Testament, but in the New Testament time frame, it meant an elder or a shepherd. It was a synonym for that same office. By the time you get to 300 to 400 AD, it was beginning to be used by some of the writers as a hierarchical position. A bishop was over some elders, and that led to a departure from the biblical pattern because that word began to be redefined. So we have to be careful that when we read a word, so if you read the word bishop in a translation today, don't think of it in terms of what a modern day person would say, oh, I understand what a bishop is, because most people would not have that same picture of what he meant in the New Testament. So you see that? That's an anachronism. That's using a word out of time and place. And it can occur when you're trying to put extra stuff in something. So I saw someone refer to this verse once, Romans 1:16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the dynamite of God. That's not a good translation. And what they did was they said, well, but dynamite comes from the same root word, dynamos, power, that, when he says it's the power of God. That's not what making a good translation is all about. We're not trying to substitute those words in there. We're trying to get the meaning, and the meaning there is power. He's not trying to say he's blowing things up with the gospel, right? So be careful of those kinds of anachronisms as we're putting things in time and place. So, brief summary. Semantics is more than just the individual words. Be aware of the context. And the context can be more than just the sentence it's in. It can be what came before it, what comes after it. All of that together is necessary for us to read it properly. And we have to consider the time period. Another simple example. When I was younger and grew up reading the King James English, and since I grew up reading King James when I was in school, I had no trouble with Shakespeare. I knew all of these and thous. That was no problem. But when Genesis, the second chapter, when it says that God needed a help meet, most of the times when I heard preachers say that, it all sounded like one word, help meet. I always wondered what a help meet was. Well, it's two words, and meet in the King James simply means suitable. That word has changed in meaning. And so the translation that I have now in New American Standard says God needed to make a helper suitable for Adam. That's a word that has changed in meaning over time. And that's how we have to be careful with some of those when we're looking at those word meanings. So word studies, in my opinion, they have some use. I'm not saying they're useless, but be careful. They are limited use. And you can find a lot more out just by reading multiple translations and being careful of it. If you require a detailed knowledge of Hebrew or Greek to understand something, then you might be trying to dig the wrong way. Just be careful of that. And your best, most reliable tool, I'll say it again, get yourself a couple of different translations. And go ahead and get one or two that are on different places on that scale. And read it, because that's the best thing you can do to overcome another gap, which is the knowledge gap. Literary gap is one thing, but unless you read it, you bring it to your heart, you're going to be missing the power of God's word. And so as we look at it and we think, wow, it's really hard because we don't even know those languages. No, we don't. We don't have to. Because in God's providence, we have wonderful English translations that we can sit down, read ourselves, share with our neighbors in a language that we can both understand. So let's take a look at that from a standpoint of, can we bridge that gap? Absolutely. We can take God's word, read it, and understand what he says.